One, two, three, four. You love her voice, you love her looks. What Melissa loves are comic books. Hi. So, if you're new to this and this is your first time watching, I'll try to clue you in as we go. Otherwise, welcome back. For the people that just arrived, you should probably go back and watch this from the very beginning because this is all one gigantic narrative in chronological order about the history of comics. So, taking one out of context might be unsatisfying. Although I admit that it's a long time commitment now because I've made so many of them. Anyways, what we're doing is a chronological exploration of the comic books in 1938 leading up to the introduction of Superman, which changes everything. And we'll talk a lot about that when we get to it. But in the meanwhile, I'm on a countdown right now. So let's review my notes and see where we're at. We're at number 19, and that is Star Comics number 12. And I'm going to talk about Jungle Town Showboat. Because I'm a horrible glutton for punishment, I'm going to start off with this Dick Ryan comic book feature. This is the artist who I've said his style reminds me of nails on a chalkboard, and this one is no different. Issue 12 is not one I have access to, so let me tell you what I think is happening in the installment from issue number 11 before this one. There is this weird framing device to the story where most of it is actually a melodrama being acted by anthropomorphic animals, but also observed by other anthropomorphic animals that came to see the play. The play moves very quickly, so quickly that we never see what's happening really. We're just getting flashes of this. We have no idea how the goats managed to escape from this trap that they were in. The staging for the play would be incredibly expensive since it includes an ice floe over a body of water. So I just don't understand why there's this framing device of them watching the show, other than so that he could have the characters making comments about the story as they're watching it, like he wanted his own audience, maybe one that appreciates what he was drawing more than I do. All right, we're done talking about that. I just can't stand this man. All right, moving on, number 18. Ace Comics number 14, Etta Kett. To explain Etta Kett, I have to explain two other comic strips first. The first was Harold Teen. Debuting back in 1919, Harold Teen was a hugely influential strip. It didn't invent the concept of the teenager, but it popularized the concept at a time when society still didn't always distinguish between child and adult. The basic concept was very similar to the later creation Archie, except that instead of a lovable klutz, Harold is the cool teenager. Harold Teen had merchandise, a radio show, two movies, and ran in newspapers for 40 years. Paul Robinson was a former railway clerk who gave it all up to try and make his fortune as a cartoonist. A couple of years after Harold Teen came out, he had his first successful strip, The Lovebirds, Byrds, that ran for 5 years. He liked his strip but knew it was missing something. So in 1925, he created a new strip that was like a continuation of the Lovebirds, except the birds were now called the Ketts, and they had a daughter who was like a gender swapped Harold Teen. And that's how you get to Etta Kett. Etta Kett was even more successful in the newspapers than Harold Teen, lasting 50 years. Though Harold Teen is still talked about today, and Etta Kett you never hear about. Uh, Paul Robinson, was denied the merchandise, radio, and movie money that Harold Teen produced. Interestingly, both Harold Teen and Etta Kett were discontinued almost immediately after the deaths of their creators instead of being continued by other hands, which leads to why you may not have heard of them today. Number 17, Feature Funnies number 8, Jane Arden. Jane Arden didn't land on many covers, so it's appropriate that she's my subject for this issue. I talked about Jane Arden last in episode 24. Now, Feature Funnies number 8 is one of those issues I don't have access to. According to the Grand Comics database, the contents of this issue were reprints of the comic strip from late November 1936. Let's look at what Jane was doing in issue 7, though. I've talked before about her rivalry with her cousin Sue, who tries to outdo Jane at every turn, this being one of the major ongoing arcs of the comic strip, and it is the focus of the strips being reprinted here. First, as a filler page before a new story arc begins, Jane tricks Sue into following her to an island. It's an island nudist colony to embarrass her at the same time as getting Sue off of Jane's trail. Jane's next assignment is to follow the deposed dictator of the nation of Honduraglia, who is in town. Comic strips and comic books will have a long, long history with using fictional names for countries instead of real countries. This was convenient when they needed a recent history in a foreign country that hadn't really happened. Honduras, the obvious real country referred to as Honduraglia, hadn't deposed a dictator since 1924, which didn't really work for the story very well. This ties in with the overlapping story arc with Sue when Sue stumbles into the dictator in a secret meeting when she thinks she's just trailing Jane. Jane sneaks on board the schooner Sue has been loaded onto to rescue her, and they discover the dictator is smuggling typewriters back into his home country. Sue locks Jane in the hold so she can get away and publish the scoop. Jane, because she stayed behind, discovers each typewriter contains a machine gun, and he's actually smuggling in arms for a revolution. Jane holds the machine gun on her captors, which holds them at bay for her to get overboard before they remember that there were no bullets in the hold. Jane gets away and gets the real scoop, humiliating Sue. It's a complex story with two competing story arcs, all contained in just 4 half pages, a master class of economy, and gives you a real idea as to why I like Jane Arden so much. The other half page is dominated by the strip Lena Pry by the same team of Monty Barrett and Russell Ross. I don't have anything good to say about Lena Pry, cartoony humor apparently not being their strong suit. I do want to point out the paper doll, which was a fad associated with female characters extending as far into the 1960s, and one that Jane Arden shared with Etta Kett, and sometimes more comically with Lena Pry herself. Number 16, Super Comics number 1. When Dell saw that United Features brought out a second title, but using all the first title's characters, they must have said, "We can do that?" Because here we have the new title from Dell, which featured almost all of Popular Comics' features, except this time it's a little different. The features moved to the new titles instead of being duplicated into the new title. It definitely hurt the contents of Popular Comics, which will never really be as good in my eyes as it was before this, but they got a brand new title out of this with most of their best features. It's also worth pointing out that this is the first time ever the word super appears in a comic book title. Only it wasn't really Dell responsible for Super Comics, it was Western Publishing that produced it and Dell distributed it. And this forces us to revisit the unusual working relationship between Dell and Western. Since these two companies already had a good working relationship, it's very unlikely Western poached the licenses from Dell. Perhaps Dell needed Super Comics done in a hurry and Western had the room on their schedule to make it happen. Anyway, Anyway, the feature that moved to Super Comics that I'm going to talk about today is Little Joe. Ed Leffingwell had been assisting his cousin Harold Gray on Little Orphan Annie when Ed was given a chance to do his own comic strip in 1933. His first try was a success, Little Joe. You might not surprise that Little Joe had similarities to a gender-flipped Little Orphan Annie. Joe Oak, a young teenager, not as young as Annie, was often off on his own having adventures or being protected by an adult that could step in when he was really in danger. First, a ranch hand called Utah that we'll meet here, and then later, a more popular character, a Mexican bandit called the General, that was either meant to be Pancho Villa or just inspired by what Americans thought Pancho Villa was like. It would be Leffingwell's last success as he died 3 years into the strip. But that didn't kill Little Joe. His brother Robert took over the strip and it continued for 4 decades. In the pages reprinted in this issue, little Joe is still being mentored by Utah, someone who is respected by all the locals but is shocked and outraged when he meets a new neighbor who refuses to show him any respect. The neighbor works for a man who has acquired the public land Utah has always used for winter grazing, but while Utah stews, little Joe decides he's going to resolve this himself and confronts the new owner, only to be completely ignored since he still looks like he's just a boy. Are little Joe and Utah going to get the respect they deserve? Maybe next issue. Number 15, Tip Top Comics number 25, Lil Abner. I last talked about Lil Abner back in episode 15. It's been hard to talk about Lil Abner because the contents are still not in the public domain and missing from most online copies of Tip Top. I don't know what the Lil Abner contents were in issue 25, but I do happen to know what the contents were in issues 27 and 28, and they focused not on Lil Abner, but the character Mammy Yokum, a little old grandma with Popeye-like strength, and the inspiration for Grandma Ben in Jeff Smith's modern classic Bone. In the span of 10 pages over 2 issues, she posed as a horse jockey, battled a robot, and then took on an entire village of rival hillbillies, with Lil Abner only appearing on the last 2 of those 10 pages. And this was possible because Lil Abner had a large ensemble cast. In episode 15, I mainly talked about Lil Abner's creator, Al Cap, and a little about the characters Abner himself and the Schmooze. Other characters included Daisy Mae Scragg, a gorgeous hillbilly girl who could have had any man in the world but naively pines for the oblivious Abner. Poppy Yokum, the lazy, ineffectual patriarch of the Yokum clan, and will have over 100 recurring characters over the course of its 43-year run in comics, not counting the characters in the comic within the comic, the Dick Tracy parody Fearless Fosdick, which is Abner's favorite comic strip, which we read as he reads in some installments. And now we begin our end run to Superman. There are no more repeats of titles between here and Action Comics number 1. So from this point on, I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to talk about, instead of one random feature from each issue, my favorite feature from each issue. Number 14, The Funnies number 20, Captain Easy. That came as no surprise, right? I've talked about Captain Easy plenty, and it's no surprise that I love it. The art set the standard for comic book art, and while Captain Easy the character may not be overflowing with personality, he's honorable and dependable and someone you would want on your side in real life. And his strips are largely grounded and realistic, but could also take absurdly comic turns as well. The first page is the very last page of the Lost at Sea storyline. Captain Easy and wealthy sportsman B.J. Barton are believed dead in a plane crash, but they're actually alive and well on Terrapin Island off the coast of Florida, where Barton wanted to get away from his family and live as a hermit for a while, with Easy there for his protection. But word still got out that Barton is still alive. The next page is the first page of the King of Kleptomania story, about a bum who claims to be a foreign king and then turns out to be a foreign king, based on a O. Henry story. It ran in 6 months' worth of Sunday pages in late 1937, and was actually my least favorite of all Captain Easy storylines, but that's still a good bar to meet and better than most. Number 13, Funny Pages, Volume 2, Number 8, Abdallah. Being a Chesler comic, you'd think I wouldn't like anything in this issue, but that's only mostly true. The standout for me was Abdallah, a fantasy story about a heroic knight, likely a prince, though that is alluded to more than it's spelled out. The name Abdallah is the best clue for the cultural model of Abdallah's kingdom, being a name so important in Islam, and suggesting he hails from Arabia. And since the arms and armor look like they come from somewhere in the range of 13th to 16th century, that means his father is someone high up in the Ottoman Empire. I suspect King Barbar's magic kingdom, for it to border a desert, has to be in Africa, though all the characters are colored as fair-skinned as if they hailed from Sweden. We know it's a fantasy world because to win the hand of King Barbar's daughter, Abdallah has to survive a trip into the desert that I mentioned before, populated by what to him seem like monsters, but to our modern eyes we can tell are dinosaurs. The strip did not invent the idea of dragons being dinosaurs. It was once a popular theory that people invented the concept of dragons to explain dinosaur bones that they found. Nor was this the only Chesler feature to use this motif. Over in Star Comics, since issue number 1, though I hadn't ever mentioned this before, there was a feature called Round Table Adventures that had King Arthur's knights occasionally fighting dinosaurs. Of the two, Abdallah is actually the one that does it better, which is why I waited till now to discuss it. Abdallah was a complete story told in 30 pages, 5 pages per issue, then reprinted the following year in the same title. This issue was the last issue of the story in which Abdallah faces his last threat, an ogre, which seems like it would be anticlimactic after all the dragons he's already killed by now, but the ogre is magically strong and too good a fighter for Abdallah in close quarters. Only after the ogre sets his cave accidentally on fire do they move the fight outdoors, and Abdallah has the room to charge the ogre from horseback, winning the day. A side plot was the jealous servant of the king who freed the ogre to start with. The ogre then kidnapped the man's son, a lucky coincidence, who was saved by Abdallah. Seeing the man owed him one, Abdallah begged the king for leniency, turning an enemy into an ally. And that was the end of Abdallah's adventures. It was the work of Craig Fox, an artist who we don't know much about other than he worked for the Chesler Studio in 1937 and 1938 and then disappeared from comic books forever. Number 12. Star Ranger number 12. The last issue of Star Ranger. The comics magazine curse strikes again with the latest of their titles being dropped. This was always my least favorite of the comics magazine Ultim Centaur titles, so I have nothing personally to recommend from it except for the cover of this issue. The artist is Jack Cole. At the very start of his comic book career, the then 24-year-old artist is still 3 years away from inventing his best-known character, Plastic Man. Hopefully we'll talk about him again. Number 11. Comics on Parade number 2, Tarzan. Now this one is kind of a cheat, because I've had very little opportunity to read old Tarzan strips, but I would say it's my favorite artist of this comic book, who was Hal Foster. Now, I've already talked about Tarzan and Hal Foster back in episode 15, so I'm not going to repeat any of it here. I do have one more reason though, and that's because in Comics on Parade number 1, instead of doing the usual thing of picking up on the middle of the storyline from the comic strips 1 or 2 years earlier, they actually started reprinting the Tarzan run back from the very beginning with its 1929 origin story, as told in comic strip form, which is actually how I would prefer all my reprints to be. So, kudos then to United Features. And kudos to you for listening to the whole thing. I hope you liked it. Our next video is going to be the very last 10 comic books before Action Comics number 1. So stay tuned, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.